On the morning of December 17, 1983, in a cramped apartment on Leninska Street in East Berlin, a woman named Katrin Vogel opened an envelope that would destroy her life. Inside was a single photograph, her two children, taken 3 hours earlier on their walk to school. There was no note, no signature, no demand. Just the image of her son and daughter, captured by a camera she had not seen, held by hands she could not identify. Sent by people who wanted her to understand one simple truth: they were always watching. She burned the photograph in the kitchen sink. She watched the faces of her children curl and blacken in the flame. And when the ashes dissolved under the tap water, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. She would do what they asked. Not because she believed in their cause, not because she hated her country or loved the West, but because the alternative, losing her children, was unthinkable. This is the story of a mother who became a traitor to save the only thing she had left. And when she finally understood what her betrayal had cost, she walked into the cold and never came back. The year was 1983, and the Cold War had reached a fever pitch of paranoia and miscalculation that historians would later call the most dangerous period since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world stood balanced on a razor's edge between two superpowers, each convinced the other was preparing for a first strike. In Washington, President Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile defense system the Kremlin saw as preparation for nuclear war. In Moscow, an aging and increasingly paranoid Soviet leadership, led by the ailing Yuri Andropov, watched every Western military exercise as if it might be cover for invasion. That autumn, NATO conducted Able Archer 83, a command post exercise simulating the transition from conventional to nuclear war. Soviet intelligence, already on edge, interpreted the drill as genuine war preparation. Nuclear forces in East Germany and Poland were quietly placed on alert. Bomber crews climbed into cockpits. Missile officers received sealed orders. For 10 days in November, the world came closer to accidental nuclear war than most civilians would ever know. In this climate of suffocating tension, East Berlin was a city of walls within walls. The Berlin Wall itself, that infamous scar of concrete, barbed wire, and guard towers, divided the city in half, separating families, lovers, and friends with brutal efficiency. But the real walls were invisible: the network of informants, surveillance devices, phone taps, and midnight interrogations that made East Germany the most thoroughly monitored society in human history. The Ministry for State Security, known simply as the Stasi, employed over 90,000 full-time officers and commanded the loyalty of nearly 200,000 unofficial informants. In a nation of 17 million people, that meant 1 in every 63 East Germans was reporting on their neighbors, colleagues, friends, or family. The Stasi kept files on 6 million citizens, more than a third of the population. They steamed open letters, recorded phone calls, planted listening devices in apartments, and cultivated informants in every workplace, school, and housing block. To live in East Berlin in 1983 was to live in a state of permanent performance. You watched what you said in restaurants, knowing the waiter might be listening. You measured your words at work, aware that a careless joke about the party could appear in a file with your name on it. You learned to speak in code with your closest friends, and even then you wondered if trust itself had become a luxury you could no longer afford. The city smelled of coal smoke and cheap tobacco. The buildings were gray concrete blocks, their facades stained with decades of industrial exhaust. The streets were clean but cheerless, lined with propaganda posters showing happy workers building socialism, while the reality was long queues for basic goods. Apartments with mold creeping up the walls, and a pervasive sense that life was something to be endured rather than lived. And yet, people adapted. They found small pleasures: a bottle of Hungarian wine shared with trusted friends, a smuggled Western magazine passed hand to hand, a child's laughter in a playground. They told themselves the system was imperfect but necessary, that sacrifice today would mean security tomorrow. that the alternative, the chaos and inequality of the West, was worse. Katrin Vogel had once believed this, or at least, she had tried to. She was 34 years old, a secretary at the East German Ministry of Culture, responsible for typing correspondence, filing reports, and maintaining records of artistic productions approved by the state. It was tedious work, the kind that numbed the mind and made the hours stretch like taffy, but it was stable employment with a modest salary and health care for her children. She had two, Thomas, age 9, and little Anna, 6. Thomas was serious and bookish, always asking questions about how things worked, the tram system, the telephone network, the locks on doors. Anna was bright and fearless, the kind of child who would climb any tree and befriend any stray dog, heedless of the dirt on her dress or the scolding that awaited at home. Their father, Klaus, had been a mechanical engineer at a factory producing precision instruments for scientific equipment. He had been a quiet man, methodical and patient. The sort who could spend hours repairing a broken radio or teaching Thomas the names of cloud formations. He had died 2 years earlier. Not heroically, not dramatically, but in the most mundane way imaginable. A heart attack at age 38 while riding the S-Bahn home from work. One moment he was alive, reading a technical manual. The next, he was slumped in his seat, and by the time the train reached the next station, he was gone. The state provided a widow's pension, but it was barely enough to cover rent and utilities. Katrine's salary helped, but after food, clothing, and school supplies, there was almost nothing left. She learned to stretch meals, watery soups bulked out with potatoes, bread toasted to hide its staleness, meat only on Sundays if the butcher had any to sell. She learned to mend clothes until they could no longer be mended, to smile at her children even when exhaustion made her bones ache. To pretend that everything would be fine when she had no idea if that was true. The first approach came in May. She was leaving the ministry after work, walking toward the tram stop, when a man in a gray coat fell into step beside her. He was perhaps 45, with thinning hair and the kind of unremarkable face that disappeared from memory the moment you looked away. "Frau Vogel," he said quietly, "a moment of your time." She kept walking. "I don't know you, but I know you. Your husband was Klaus Vogel, engineer, deceased April 1981. Your son Thomas attends Carlep Connect School. Your daughter Anna has a talent for drawing." He paused. "You're struggling financially." She stopped. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Who are you?" "A friend," he said. "Someone who can help." "I don't need help." "Everyone needs help, Frau Vogel. Especially those with children to feed." He handed her a folded piece of paper. "Think about it." Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. That night, after the children were asleep, she opened the paper. Inside was a phone number and a single typed sentence: "We pay well for small favors." She burned it, just as she would later burn the photograph of her children. But 2 weeks later, when Anna came home from school crying because the other children had mocked her worn-out shoes, and Thomas quietly asked if they could afford a new notebook because his was full, she walked to a public phone booth and dialed the number from memory. The second meeting took place in Treptower Park, near the Soviet War Memorial. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the park was crowded with families enjoying the rare sunshine. Katrine sat on a bench feeding breadcrumbs to the pigeons while Thomas and Anna played on the grass nearby. The man in the gray coat appeared again, sitting down beside her without invitation. "You called," he said. "I need money," she replied, not looking at him. "Of course you do. And we need information." "What kind of information?" "Nothing dangerous. Nothing that would harm your country. Just small things. Documents that cross your desk at the ministry. Reports, schedules, names. That's espionage. That's survival." He watched the children playing. "Thomas needs new shoes too, doesn't he? And I imagine the rent is due soon." She wanted to stand up and walk away. She wanted to report this conversation to the Stasi, to prove her loyalty, to protect herself and her family by doing the right thing. But the right thing wouldn't feed her children. "How much?" she asked. 500 marks per month. In cash. No records, no receipts. 500 marks. Nearly as much as her salary. enough to buy proper shoes, fresh meat, new notebooks, maybe even a winter coat for Anna. What do you want? For now, just copies. When something crosses your desk that mentions foreign delegations, cultural exchanges, travel schedules, you make a copy. We'll arrange collection. And if I refuse? He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then we'll find someone else. And you'll continue as you are, stretching every pfennig, watching your children go without, wondering how long you can keep pretending everything is fine. He stood to leave, then paused. One more thing, Frau Vogel. Don't think about reporting this conversation. We have friends everywhere. And if you become a problem, double quotes, he glanced at the children. Well, accidents happen. He walked away, leaving her alone with the pigeons and the terrible weight of the choice she had already made. The first document she copied was a schedule of Czech musicians visiting East Berlin for a state-sponsored concert. Harmless enough, or so she told herself. She used the office photocopier after hours, when the building was nearly empty, her hands shaking so badly she had to try 3 times to get the pages aligned properly. The collection was simple. She left the copies in a folded newspaper on a specific bench in Alexanderplatz. 20 minutes later, when she circled back, the newspaper was gone. The money arrived 2 days later, slipped under her apartment door in a plain envelope while she was at work. 500 marks in worn bills, as promised. That night she bought real butter, fresh eggs, and a cut of pork. She made Thomas and Anna a proper meal, and when they smiled at her across the table, she told herself she had done the right thing. But alone in the dark, after the children were asleep, she lay awake staring at the ceiling and feeling something cold and permanent settle in her chest. Over the following months, the requests escalated slowly, almost imperceptibly, like water rising 1 millimeter at a time. A list of East German artists approved for travel to Moscow. Copies of correspondence between the Culture Ministry and Soviet officials regarding censorship policies. The names of party members assigned to vet theatrical productions. Each task was small. Each could be rationalized. And each came with 500 marks that kept her children fed, clothed, and safe. She told herself she was not betraying her country. The information she provided was administrative trivia, nothing that could harm national security. She was simply surviving in a system that gave her no other choice. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, she knew the truth. She had become exactly what the state warned against. She was an enemy of the people, a traitor, a spy. And the worst part was how easy it had become. In September, the man in the gray coat approached her with a different kind of request. "There's a diplomat," he said. "Soviet, attached to the embassy's cultural liaison office. He's been traveling between Berlin and Moscow regularly. We need to know his schedule." "That's not cultural affairs," she said. "That's political. It's all connected, Frau Vogel. Culture, politics, security. In your world, there are no walls between them." He paused. 2,000 marks for this one. Enough to buy winter coats for both children. 2,000 marks. A fortune. Why do you need this? That's not your concern. If I'm taking the risk, it's absolutely my concern. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded a small concession. "We want to talk to him. Away from handlers. That's all. You want to turn him. We want to offer him a choice. The same choice we offered you." She thought of the photograph that had started this, her children captured by invisible eyes. The implicit threat, the impossible decision. What if he refuses? Then he goes back to Moscow, and nothing changes. But if he accepts, double quotes, the man smiled. Let's just say he could be very valuable to both sides. She should have refused. Should have walked away, consequences be damned. Instead, she thought of winter coming, of Anna's threadbare coat, of Thomas growing out of his shoes again. "I'll see what I can find," she heard herself say. The diplomat's name was Viktor Fedorov. She found his file in the ministry's records room, a slim folder containing travel authorizations and meeting schedules. She copied everything, her hands steady now, her conscience carefully locked away in a place where she wouldn't have to look at it. The exchange happened as usual, newspaper on a bench, money under her door, but this time, something felt different. The weight of it. The sense that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. 3 weeks later, she saw a brief item in News Deutschland. The party newspaper, Soviet cultural attached, dies in traffic accident near Checkpoint Charlie. No details. No investigation mentioned. Just a single paragraph noting the regrettable loss of a dedicated servant of Soviet-German friendship. She read it 3 times, the words blurring in front of her eyes. Traffic accident. She knew what that meant. Everyone in East Berlin knew what that meant. When someone died conveniently, when the state described it as an accident without offering details, when the obituary was published without ceremony or follow-up, it meant the person had become inconvenient. It meant they had been removed. Had Fedorov refused to cooperate? Had the Americans pressured him too hard? Had he threatened to expose the network that had targeted him? She would never know. But that night, she vomited until there was nothing left in her stomach. And when Thomas asked if she was sick, she locked herself in the bathroom and sobbed silently into a towel so her children wouldn't hear. She wanted to stop. Desperately, achingly, she wanted to walk away. But the man in the gray coat had been right about one thing. There was no walking away. She was in the machine now, a cog that could not simply stop turning without the whole mechanism noticing. And then, in early December, the photograph arrived. She stared at it for a full minute, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. Thomas and Anna, walking to school, unaware of the camera, unaware of the threat, unaware that their mother's choices had painted targets on their backs. The message was clear. She was not an employee. She was an asset. And assets did not have the luxury of quitting. That evening, the phone rang. A voice she didn't recognize, calm, American-accented, speaking German with textbook precision. Frau Vogel, I trust you received our message. What do you want? There's a file. Comes across your desk next week. It contains names of Stasi officers working undercover in West Berlin. We need that file. Her blood turned to ice. That's not culture ministry business. I don't have access to. You'll find a way. You're resourceful. If I'm caught with that, they'll... Yes, the voice said calmly. They will, which is why you'll be very careful. 10,000 marks, Frau Vogel. Enough to leave East Berlin if you're smart. Enough to start over. I can't. You can. And you will. Because if you don't, that photograph won't be the last message you receive. Do we understand each other? She understood. She understood that she had sold herself piece by piece until there was nothing left to bargain with. She understood that the Americans who had promised to help her were no different from the system she lived under. Both saw her as a tool, disposable and replaceable. And she understood that her children, the only pure and innocent things left in her life, were now hostages to her choices. Yes, she whispered. The line went dead. The file arrived on December 14th, delivered by interagency courier in a sealed envelope marked streng geheim, top secret. It should never have come to the Culture Ministry at all, but bureaucratic errors happened even in the most efficient surveillance state. Someone had misrouted it, and it landed on her desk by mistake. She had perhaps 6 hours before someone realized the error and came to retrieve it. Inside were 12 pages listing names, cover identities, and operational sectors of Stasi officers working undercover in West Berlin, embedded in businesses, universities, even the offices of West German political parties. It was a complete map of East Germany's intelligence presence in enemy territory. If this information reached the CIA, every officer on the list would be exposed. Some would be arrested. Others would simply disappear, vanished into the machinery of Cold War justice. And those officers had families, children, lives, just like her. She sat at her desk, the file open in front of her, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to think clearly. She thought about Klaus, who had believed in the system, who had worked hard and raised his children to be honest and kind, who had never harmed anyone and had died quietly on a train without leaving her any guidance for moments like this. She thought about Thomas and Anna, who deserved a mother who could look them in the eye without shame, who deserved to grow up in a world where people didn't have to choose between survival and decency. And she thought about Viktor Fedorov, the Soviet diplomat who had died in a convenient traffic accident because he had become caught between two empires that valued intelligence more than human life. She had been a coward. She had told herself she was protecting her children, but the truth was simpler. She had been afraid. Afraid of poverty, afraid of hardship, afraid of the consequences of saying no. But fear had made her a traitor. And if she continued down this path, fear would make her a murderer. The Americans had given her a choice, but it was a false choice. The same false choice every empire offers its pawns. Cooperate or suffer. Betray or be destroyed. There was a third option. One that would cost her everything, but would perhaps, just perhaps, let her children remember her as something other than a traitor. She closed the file, placed it back in its envelope, and picked up the phone. The number she dialed was not the American contact. It was not the man in the gray coat. It was the direct line to the Stasi district office in Lichtenberg, a number every East German citizen knew but prayed they would never have to use. A woman answered on the second ring. Ministry for State Security. Identify yourself. Katrine's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. My name is Katrine Vogel. I work at the Ministry of Culture. I need to report an espionage contact. There was a brief pause, then the sound of papers rustling. Remain on the line. 30 seconds later, a male voice came on. Deeper, colder, carrying the weight of authority. This is Officer Hauptmann. You're reporting espionage? Against me. I've been compromised by Western intelligence. Explain. She told him everything. The man in the gray coat, the phone number, the requests for documents, the money, the photograph of her children. The American voice on the phone demanding the Stasi file that sat on her desk at that very moment. She left nothing out. Every detail, every meeting, every copied document. She described her fear, her desperation, her weakness. She confessed to treason with the same methodical precision Klaus had once used to explain mechanical systems to Thomas. When she finished, there was silence on the other end. Where are you now? Hauptmann asked. My office. Ministry of Culture, 4th floor. The file they want is here. Do not move. Do not touch the file. Do not contact anyone. Officers are being dispatched. Do you understand? Yes. Frau Vogel, if you're lying, if this is some attempt to... I'm not lying, she said quietly. I did everything they asked, and now I'm turning myself in. The line went dead. She sat at her desk, hands folded in her lap, and waited for the machine to arrive. They came within 20 minutes, 3 men in dark suits, moving with practiced efficiency. The lead officer was Hauptmann himself, a man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had witnessed 1,000 interrogations. He examined the file without touching it, verified the seal, then nodded to his colleagues. Frau Vogel, come with us. She stood. My children, they're at home. A neighbor watches them after school, but they'll be cared for. I need to know they're safe. Please. Whatever you do to me, they're innocent. They knew nothing about any of this. Hauptmann studied her face. If what you've told us is true, and if you cooperate fully, your children will be protected. That's all I can promise. It was more than she had any right to expect. They led her through the building's rear exit, away from the main corridors where colleagues might see. A black Volga sedan waited in the alley, engine running, windows tinted. She was placed in the back seat between 2 officers. No handcuffs, not yet, but the message was clear. She was no longer a citizen. She was a prisoner. The drive to Stasi headquarters in Lichtenberg took 15 minutes through gray streets where people went about their lives unaware that in the back of that black car sat a woman who had betrayed them all. The interrogation began at 1947 hours, according to the timestamp on the recording that would later be filed in the archives. The room was exactly as she had imagined. Bare concrete walls, a metal table, 3 chairs, a single light fixture casting harsh shadows. On the table sat a tape recorder, its reels turning silently, capturing every word, every breath, every hesitation. Hauptmann sat across from her, a thick folder open in front of him. Another officer, younger, stood by the door with arms crossed. State your full name for the record, Hauptmann began. Katrin Elizabeth Vogel, née Richter. Date of birth, March 3, 1949. Current address, Leninska Street, Society, Apartment 3B, Berlin. Employment. Secretary, Ministry of Culture, Department of International Artistic Relations. How long have you been passing classified information to Western intelligence? 7 months. Since May. And you claim you did this under coercion? No. She met his eyes. I did it for money. At first, they offered money, and I needed it, and I was weak. The coercion came later, when I tried to stop. He made a note, described the initial contact. She repeated everything she had told him on the phone, adding details, the exact location of each meeting, the denominations of the bills she had received, the specific documents she had copied. She held nothing back. Hauptmann listened without expression, occasionally asking for clarification, his pen moving across paper in rapid shorthand. The man who first approached you, describe him in detail. Mid-40s, perhaps 175 centimeters. Thin brown hair, receding. Gray eyes. No distinguishing marks I could see. He wore a gray coat, dark trousers, common shoes. His German was perfect, no accent I could detect. Could he have been East German? Yes. Or West German, or Soviet. He could have been anyone, and you never learned his name. He never offered one. Hauptmann opened a different folder and produced a series of photographs, surveillance shots of men in various locations, some clear, others grainy and indistinct. Do you recognize any of these individuals? She studied each photo carefully. On the 7th one, she stopped. Him. That's him. The man from the park. Hauptmann made another note, his face revealing nothing. The voice on the phone. The American. Describe it. Male. Middle-aged, I think. Calm. Precise German but American accented. Like someone who learned the language in school, not from living here. And he specifically demanded the Stasi personnel file. Yes. How did he know it would cross your desk? I don't know. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just assumed that eventually something valuable would appear, and they were right. She paused. Or maybe they have someone else inside the ministry who told them the file had been misrouted. That possibility hung in the air like smoke. Hauptmann closed the folder. You understand the severity of what you've done. Under paragraph 99 of the Criminal Code, espionage against the German Democratic Republic carries a sentence of 15 years to life. In cases involving state security, execution is possible. I understand. You also understand that cooperation may be considered a mitigating factor. I'm not cooperating to save myself, she said quietly. I'm cooperating because what I did was wrong. And because my children deserve better than to grow up believing their mother was a traitor who escaped justice. For the first time, something flickered in Hauptmann's eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement. He had seen many traitors in this room. The ideological defectors who believed the West offered freedom, the greedy ones who sold secrets for luxuries, the foolish ones who thought they could play both sides. But a traitor who turned herself in, who confessed without bargaining, who asked for nothing except that her children be spared the shame? That was rare. We'll continue tomorrow, he said, standing. You'll be held in detention pending further investigation. My children are being cared for by child services. They've been told you're ill and need to spend time in hospital. For now, that's all they need to know. It was a mercy she hadn't expected. Thank you. He gestured to the officer by the door. Take her to holding. The cell was 2 meters by 3 meters, containing a narrow cot, a metal toilet, and nothing else. A single barred window high on the wall showed a rectangle of dark sky. The door was solid steel with a viewing slot that opened from the outside. Katrin sat on the cot and allowed herself to think about her children for the first time since making the call. Were they frightened? Did they believe the story about hospital? Thomas was smart, too smart. He would sense something was wrong. And Anna, sensitive Anna, would cry herself to sleep without understanding why. She hoped the neighbor caring for them was kind. She hoped someone had thought to pack Anna's stuffed rabbit, the one Klaus had won for her at a fair the summer before he died. She hoped Thomas remembered to help his sister brush her teeth. She hoped they would forgive her. The tears came then, silently, without drama. She cried for Klaus, who had deserved a better wife. She cried for her children, who had deserved a better mother. And she cried for herself, not in self-pity, but in grief for the person she had been before. Fear had hollowed her out and filled the empty space with compromise. But beneath the grief was something else, a small, hard seed of relief. She had stopped running. She had stepped off the wheel. Whatever punishment awaited her, at least it would be honest. At least her children would know that in the end, their mother had chosen truth over survival. It was cold comfort, but it was all she had. The interrogations continued for 9 days. Each morning she was brought from her cell to the same bare room, where Hauptmann and his colleagues asked the same questions in different ways, cross-referencing her answers, testing for inconsistencies, building a complete picture of the network that had compromised her. She told them everything: the drop sites, the signals for leaving documents, the amount of money she had received, and where she had hidden it under a loose floorboard in her bedroom. They had already found it. The specific document she had copied, and when, on the 4th day, they showed her photographs of the bench in Alexanderplatz where she had left the newspaper drops. "We've had this location under intermittent surveillance for months," Hauptmann explained. "We knew it was being used for dead drops, but we didn't know who was servicing it. You've confirmed several suspicions. Have you caught them? The man in the gray coat? That's classified." Which meant no, she realized. Or not yet. The Americans were too careful, too experienced. They had burned her as an asset the moment she made that phone call. And anyone connected to her would have disappeared into new identities within hours. On the 7th day, they brought in a different officer, a woman, perhaps 50, with shrewd eyes and a gentler manner. She sat across from Katrin and spoke without the formal language of interrogation. "I have children too," she said. "A son and a daughter." "I understand why you did what you did." Katrin said nothing. "The state takes care of its own, Frau Vogel. Your children won't suffer for your mistakes. They'll be placed in a good school, given proper care, taught to be productive citizens. Taught to forget me, you mean? Taught to understand that even good people make terrible choices when they're desperate." "That's not the same as forgetting." She paused. "You could see them, you know, before the trial. One last visit. If you cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, it was bait. A final test to see if she would bargain, if she would try to negotiate her confession." Katrin met the woman's eyes. "I've told you everything I know. I'm not holding anything back to trade for favors. If you want to let me see my children, that's your decision. But my testimony doesn't have conditions attached." The woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you." The trial was held in a closed military court on January 9, 1984. Katrin stood in the defendant's box, wearing the same clothes she had been arrested in, now wrinkled and stale after weeks in detention. The judge was a severe man in his 60s, flanked by 2 military assessors. A state prosecutor read the charges: espionage, treason, betrayal of state secrets. Her assigned defense attorney, a young man barely out of law school, made a brief statement about coercion and desperation, arguing for leniency based on her voluntary confession and cooperation. The prosecutor countered that the damage had been done regardless of her remorse, that the security of the state had been compromised, and that an example must be made. Katrin was given the chance to speak. "I don't ask for mercy," she said, her voice steady. "I did what I'm accused of. I betrayed the trust placed in me by the state, and I endangered the lives of officers who serve this country. I did it because I was afraid for my children and because I was weak. But fear and weakness are not excuses. They're explanations, and poor ones at that." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I turned myself in because I realized that if I continued, I would become something my children should never know. I would rather they grow up believing their mother was a criminal who faced justice than a coward who sold her soul and got away with it." She looked at the judge. "I have one request. Only one. When my children are old enough to understand, when they ask what happened to me and why, please tell them the truth. Don't let them believe I abandoned them. Don't let them think I didn't love them. Tell them I made terrible mistakes and that I tried to fix them the only way I knew how. Tell them I'm sorry." The judge made a note, his face unreadable. The verdict was delivered after a brief deliberation. Guilty on all charges. The sentence, 12 years in prison, with eligibility for reduced sentence based on exemplary behavior and continued cooperation with state security. It was, by the standards of such cases, remarkably lenient. Others had been executed for less. As the guards led her from the courtroom, she thought of Thomas and Anna, and wondered if 12 years was enough time for them to forget her face. She was transferred to Honeck, a women's prison in Saxony, built in the 19th century and converted into a facility for political prisoners. The walls were thick stone, the cells were cold, and the women inside were a mixture of dissidents, defectors, and traitors, all of them punished for choosing the wrong side in a war that had no front lines. Katrin worked in the prison textile factory, sewing uniforms 14 hours a day, her hands developing calluses that would never fully heal. She shared a cell with 3 other women, a teacher who had tried to escape to West Germany, a nurse who had treated injured dissidents, and a journalist who had written too honestly about party corruption. They told each other their stories on cold nights, whispering so the guards wouldn't hear, creating a small pocket of humanity in a place designed to erase it. The teacher, Ingrid, asked her once, "Do you regret turning yourself in?" Katrin thought about it. "I regret what I did. I regret being weak. But turning myself in? No. If I hadn't, I would have kept sinking until there was nothing left of me worth saving." You think there's something worth saving now? I don't know. But at least I stopped digging. Letters from her children arrived twice a year, brief and carefully supervised. Thomas wrote in neat handwriting about his grades, his classes, his growing interest in mathematics. Anna's letters were messier, filled with drawings of flowers and cats, always ending with, "I miss you, Mama." Katrin read each letter 100 times, memorizing every word, every loop of ink, every misspelling. She was allowed to write back, but her letters were censored, stripped of anything too emotional or political. She told them she loved them. She told them to study hard and be kind. She told them she was proud of who they were becoming. She never told them the truth of what she had done. That would come later, if at all. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Katrin heard about it from a guard, a younger woman who had always been less harsh than the others. She came to the cell with tears in her eyes and said simply, "It's over. They're tearing down the wall." Within weeks, the entire structure of East German authority began to collapse. The Stasi files were seized by citizens storming headquarters. Political prisoners were released in waves. The government that had built its power on surveillance and fear simply dissolved, like salt in water. Katrin was released on December 20, 1989, after serving 5 years and 11 months of her sentence. She walked out of Honeck into a world she barely recognized. The streets were filled with people celebrating, with West German cars, with colors and sounds and freedom that felt surreal after years of gray confinement. A social worker met her at the gate and explained that her children had been informed of her release. They were living with Klaus's sister in a small town near Dresden. They had been told, finally, the truth of what their mother had done and why. "Do they want to see me?" Katrin asked. The social worker hesitated. "Thomas does. Anna isn't sure yet. She's angry. She needs time." Time. Yes, that made sense. Anna had been 6 when Katrin had disappeared. Now she was 12, nearly grown, shaped by absence and explanation into someone her mother didn't know. "Can you take me to them? Not today, but soon. Give them a few days to prepare." The reunion happened in a supervised visitation room in Dresden. Neutral territory that belonged to neither the past nor the future. Thomas arrived first. He was 15 now, tall and thin, with Klaus's serious eyes and careful movements. He stood in the doorway, staring at her as if she might be a ghost. Ma. Hello, Thomas. He crossed the room in 3 quick steps and hugged her hard, desperately, the way a drowning person grabs a rope. She held him and felt his shoulders shake with sobs he had probably been holding for 6 years. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. They told me what happened, what you did, why you stopped. Do you hate me? He pulled back, wiping his eyes. I don't know. I'm trying to understand. Aunt Maria explained it, but double quotes, he shook his head. You gave information to the Americans. People might have died because of that, I know, but you turned yourself in. You told the truth. Yes. Why? Because continuing would have made me into someone I couldn't live with. And because I wanted you and your sister to know that even when people make terrible mistakes, they can still choose to stop. It doesn't fix what was broken, but it stops the breaking from getting worse. He thought about this for a long time. Aunt Maria says you were trying to feed us. That's how it started, but it became something else. Something I should have stopped sooner. I wish Papa hadn't died, Thomas said quietly. None of this would have happened if he was still here. I know. I wish that too. They sat together in silence. And Katrin understood that forgiveness, if it came at all, would take years. Thomas was trying, reaching across the gap, but the wound was deep, and the scar tissue would always be tender. Anna never came to that first meeting. Or the second. Or the third. Katrin found work as a cleaning woman in a Dresden office building. The reunified Germany had little use for former East German bureaucrats, especially those with treason convictions. She lived in a tiny apartment, saved every pfennig, and wrote letters to Anna that were returned unopened. Thomas visited monthly. They built something together, not the relationship they'd had before, but a new thing. Honest and fragile and real. He told her about school, about university plans, about a girl he liked. She listened and offered what wisdom she could, knowing that her words carried the weight of her past. On his 18th birthday, he brought her a gift, a photograph of Klaus, young and smiling, holding baby Thomas in his arms. I thought you should have this, he said. She cried for an hour after he left. In 1995, 6 years after the wall fell, Katrin received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page typed in English, which she had learned to read during her years in prison. Frau Vogel, you don't know me, but I know you. I was the officer who processed your file in 1983. I want you to know that the information you provided helped us identify and shut down a network that was responsible for considerable harm on both sides. Your confession also prevented what could have been a catastrophic breach of security. What you did required courage of a kind that few people possess. I cannot speak to your original actions, but your decision to stop, to confess, and to accept the consequences may have saved lives. I thought you should know that. The letter was unsigned. Katrin read it once, then burned it in her kitchen sink, watching the ash curl and blacken just as she had burned that first photograph of her children 12 years earlier. She didn't know if the letter was genuine or some final psychological operation. She didn't know if it was meant to comfort her or to close a file in some distant archive. But she knew this: she had stopped. And in stopping, she had become someone her children could know, even if they chose not to. That would have to be enough. Anna came to see her when she was 21, a university student studying literature, with Klaus's dark hair and Katrin's sharp features. They met in a cafe in Berlin, near where the wall had once stood. The physical barrier was gone, but the invisible walls remained, between mothers and daughters, between past and present, between forgiveness and memory. I don't know why I'm here, Anna said. I'm glad you are. Thomas says you're not a monster. I'm not. But I did monstrous things. Anna stirred her coffee, not drinking. I read the file. After the Stasi archives opened, I requested your file. I read everything, the interrogations, the trial transcripts, the letters you sent that I never answered. And I'm angry. I'm angry that you made choices that destroyed our family. I'm angry that I grew up without a mother. I'm angry that when people ask about you, I don't know what to say. You should be angry. But I'm also... She stopped, searching for words. I'm also confused, because you stopped. You could have kept going, could have taken their money and their protection and disappeared into some new life in the West, but you didn't. You called the Stasi. You confessed. You went to prison for us. Not for you. For myself. Because I couldn't live with what I was becoming. That's what I don't understand. How do you live with it now? Katrine thought about those long nights in Honeck, about the letters she had written and the silences she had endured. By accepting that some things can't be fixed. By trying to be honest about what I did and why. By hoping that someday, you and your brother can look at me and see a human being who made terrible choices and tried to stop making them. Not a hero, not a villain, just someone who failed and kept breathing anyway. Anna was quiet for a long time. Then, I can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever, I know, but I'd like to try to understand. If you're willing to talk about it. Always. For as long as you want. They finished their coffee in silence, and when Anna left, she didn't hug her mother or make promises. But she didn't return the next letter unopened. And that, Katrine thought, was a beginning. Years passed. The world moved on. The Cold War became history, studied by students who had never known the fear, the paranoia, the impossible choices. Thomas became an engineer, like his father. He married, had children of his own, and brought them to visit their grandmother in the small apartment where she lived alone. The children called her Oma and knew nothing of spies or secrets, just an old woman who made them cookies and told them stories. Anna became a writer, publishing novels about divided cities and families broken by history. She never wrote directly about her mother, but Katrine recognized herself in the characters, the women who made desperate choices, who lived with consequences, who tried to teach their children that love and failure were not opposites but companions. They never spoke of forgiveness in explicit terms, but they spoke, and sometimes that was enough. Katrine Vogel died in 2008, at age 59, from complications of pneumonia. She had been cleaning an office building late into the evening, caught cold in the winter rain, and never fully recovered. Thomas was with her at the end. Anna came the next day, too late, and stood by the hospital bed where her mother's body lay covered with a white sheet. Among Katrine's possessions, they found a box of letters, every letter they had sent her in prison, preserved and carefully organized by date. They found photographs of Klaus, worn soft at the edges from handling, and they found a single piece of paper, folded small, with a handwritten note. To my children, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I won't ask forgiveness because I know that's not mine to demand. But I want you to know that every choice I made, the terrible ones and the true ones, came from love. I was a coward when I should have been brave, and brave when it was too late to matter. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. The world we lived through was cruel and complicated, built on lies we were all forced to tell. I told more than most. I stopped when I could. That doesn't balance the scales, but it's all I have to offer. Be kinder than I was. Be braver than I was. And if you have children of your own, teach them that the hardest thing in this world is not to survive, but to survive with your soul intact. Your mother, who tried. Anna folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. She did try, she said quietly. Thomas nodded. In the end, she did. There are no monuments to Katrine Vogel, no plaques, no historical markers, no documentaries celebrating her courage or condemning her betrayal. Her story exists only in classified files that few will ever read, in the memories of her children, and in the silence that follows when someone asks what happened to all the small people caught between empires that cared nothing for their lives. She was neither hero nor villain. She was a woman who betrayed her country for money, then betrayed her handlers for conscience. She paid the price in full and asked for nothing in return except that her children might know she had tried to stop the damage before it consumed everything. In the vast and brutal machinery of the Cold War, individual stories like hers were crushed into dust, forgotten by the powers that had used them and discarded by the history that followed. But they mattered nonetheless. the mother who spied to feed her children, who discovered too late what her survival had cost, and who chose truth over escape when truth was all she had left. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile morality becomes when survival is at stake, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten, not because they're heroic, but because they're human. And humanity, in all its failure and grace, deserves to be remembered. The file on Katrin Vogel remains in the German Federal Archives, available to researchers by appointment. It contains 247 pages of interrogation transcripts, surveillance reports, and trial documents. On the final page, someone, perhaps Hauptmann, perhaps another officer, wrote a single line in pencil. She confessed when she could have run. That counts for something. It does. Not enough to erase what was done, but enough to remember that even in the darkest machinery of state power and ideological war, individual human beings still had the capacity to stop, to turn around, to face the consequences of their choices rather than let them multiply in the dark. Katrin Vogel spied for the enemy to feed her children. When she understood what it had cost, she turned herself in. Her last request, that her children never know who she had been, was never granted. Instead, they learned exactly who she had been: a woman who failed, who stopped failing, and who spent the rest of her life trying to teach them that the measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in what they do when they hit the ground. The Cold War ended, the wall fell, the empires crumbled. But the stories remain, quiet, human, and true. And in the silence that follows, we're left with a single question. What would we have done if survival meant betrayal and truth meant losing everything we loved? Most of us will never know. Katrin Vogel did, and she chose.